So Prince William inherited an estate that Queen Elizabeth spent decades keeping completely out of the public eye, and the way it went down has apparently sent Camilla's family into a private fury that's still reverberating through royal circles. And the part that makes this genuinely interesting isn't the inheritance itself. It's the contradiction at the center of the whole thing. Camilla's children reportedly had expectations about what they might receive, or at least what consideration they might be shown, after watching their mother spend nearly 2 decades married to the king. But the Queen's arrangements didn't just leave them out. They were structured in a way that made those exclusions deliberate, legally airtight, and essentially impossible to challenge. So the question becomes, why? Why did Elizabeth, who was famously precise about these things, make a choice that she had to know would create exactly this kind of tension? The estate itself is one of those properties that most people have never heard of. It's not Balmoral, it's not Sandringham, it's not any of the royal residences that show up in documentaries or get photographed for magazine spreads. It's a private holding, one that the Queen owned personally rather than through the Crown Estate. That distinction matters more than it might seem, because properties held personally can be disposed of personally. The Queen didn't need parliamentary approval or committee review or public consultation. She could decide who got what entirely on her own terms. And she did. For most of her reign, she kept this particular estate so quiet that even experienced royal correspondents had trouble getting clear information about it. The staff signed confidentiality agreements that made candid conversation impossible. The visits she made there were rarely publicized. It was, by all accounts, a place she valued precisely because it existed outside the machinery of monarchy, outside the protocols and the procedures, and the endless committees that governed almost every other aspect of her life. She could protect it, and she could choose who would have it when she was gone. By the time Prince Charles married Camilla Parker Bowles in 2005, the landscape of royal inheritance had already shifted considerably from what it had been a generation earlier. Camilla's arrival wasn't just a romantic development, it was a structural one. She came with a family, with history, with connections that stretched into the older aristocratic networks of Britain in ways that weren't always immediately obvious to outside observers. Her children from her first marriage, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopez, were adults by then, polished, well-connected, comfortable in the social world that brushes up against the monarchy without quite belonging to it. And as their mother's position within the royal family grew more secure, so did their proximity to the privileges that came with that position. Not direct claims, nothing as blunt as that, but proximity is its own kind of currency in aristocratic Britain, and the closer Camilla got to the center of royal power, the more her family watched what that power might eventually yield. That's the context you need to understand, because when the Queen made her private decisions about this estate, she wasn't making them in a vacuum. She was making them in a world where every significant royal asset was being quietly tracked by a constellation of families, advisors, and interested parties, each with their own sense of what the future ought to look like. The Queen knew all of this. She knew it the way she knew most things about the people around her. Not loudly, not through confrontation, but through the patient, decades-long accumulation of information that came from watching powerful people operate at close range for the better part of a century. So when she finally made her decision, it wasn't impulsive, it was deliberate, it was clear, and it pointed in one direction. Toward William, the question that serious observers started asking after her passing in September of 2022 wasn't what she had decided. It was why. Why William specifically? Why not a broader distribution among the senior royals? Why, in a family where appearances and diplomacy had always mattered enormously, did the Queen make a choice that was so pointed, so clean, so impossible to misread? The answer requires understanding something about how Elizabeth viewed the monarchy itself. She didn't see the crown as a sentiment. She saw it as a structure, a living institution that needed protecting from the inside just as much as it needed defending from outside pressure. And structures, in her view, required continuity. They required someone at the center who understood what the whole thing was actually for. She had watched Charles for decades. She loved him, but she also understood him. She understood his complications, his passions, his tendency to let personal conviction override institutional caution. She had watched him nearly tear the fabric of the monarchy apart during the years of his marriage to Diana. She had watched the rehabilitation that followed. She had watched him find steadiness eventually through his relationship with Camilla. But watching someone find steadiness is not the same as trusting them with everything. William was different. William had grown up inside the storm. He had experienced the chaos of his parents' marriage and its collapse from the inside. He had stood at his mother's funeral at 15 years old and carried that grief with a composure that was almost difficult to witness. He had spent his adult years building something that the monarchy had struggled to produce for generations: a stable marriage, a grounded family, a public image, rooted not in performance, but in something that felt, at least from the outside, genuinely real. The Queen saw all of that. She saw it, and she valued it in the way that someone who has spent 70 years holding an institution together valued stability above almost everything else. William was not just the next in line after his father. He was, in the Queen's private calculation, the anchor the monarchy would need when the ground began to shift, and she acted accordingly. The estate passed to William, not through accident or default. It passed to him through a series of carefully constructed legal arrangements that the Queen had been refining for years before her death. People close to the process have described it as meticulous, every detail considered, every potential challenge anticipated. It was not the work of someone making a hasty decision at the end of a long life. It was the work of someone who had been thinking about this moment for a very long time. Now here is where the story takes its first sharp turn, because the estate did not pass only to William in isolation. The arrangements the Queen made also involved specific exclusions. Properties and assets that might reasonably have been expected to flow in certain directions were redirected quietly, legally, but unmistakably. And among the names that appeared on the wrong side of those exclusions were names connected by family and by expectation to Camilla. This is the part that nobody in the palace wanted to talk about publicly. The official line, to the extent that there was one, was that the Queen's estate arrangements were private matters and that speculation about their contents was unhelpful. That's the kind of language institutions use when they want to say nothing while appearing to say something reasonable. But behind that language, the reality was considerably less tidy. Camilla's children had grown up watching their mother navigate one of the most complicated social ascents in modern British history. They had been present for the slow, difficult rehabilitation of her public image. They had watched the woman who was once described in the most savage terms by the British press become a duchess, then a queen consort. They had been at the wedding, they had been at the coronation, they had, by all accounts, come to regard certain things as settled, not in a grasping way necessarily, not with the naked ambition of people who have spent their lives scheming, but with the quiet confidence of people who have watched a situation develop over many years and drawn conclusions about where it was heading. The estate was not the only thing they had expectations about, but it was significant. It was the kind of asset whose transfer carries a message that goes beyond its financial value. When a property of that history and standing is directed firmly away from one branch of a family and toward another, it doesn't feel like a neutral administrative decision. It feels like a verdict. And that's precisely how Camilla's family received it. The fury, when it came, didn't arrive as a public statement. The Parker Bowles family are not the kind of people who hold press conferences to air grievances about inheritance arrangements. They operate in a world where that kind of open display would be considered catastrophically undignified. But fury doesn't need a press conference to make itself felt. It travels through private conversations, through pointed silences at family gatherings, through the carefully worded observations that people in that world make to trusted journalists they've known for 30 years. It travels through the channels that the British upper classes have been using for centuries to communicate displeasure without ever technically saying anything that could be quoted directly. And it was traveling fast. The question that kept coming up in those private conversations was one that cut to the heart of everything. Had Camilla known? Had she been aware of what the Queen was arranging? Had she seen it coming and chosen not to warn her children? Or had she been genuinely in the dark, discovering the full picture only after Elizabeth was gone? That question had no clean answer, and the absence of a clean answer created a tension of its own. Because if Camilla had known and said nothing, her children's anger had a very specific target. And if she had not known, then the Queen had made a deliberate choice to exclude people connected to her son's wife without so much as a quiet word of warning. Either way, the picture was not a comfortable one. William, for his part, said nothing publicly. He accepted the inheritance. He did what the legal arrangements required him to do, and he did it with the same composure that had defined his public life since he was a teenager standing in the rain outside Westminster Abbey. But composure is not the same as innocence, and the people watching him most closely knew that he had understood exactly what the Queen was giving him, not just the estate, the advantage Tom Parker Bowles had spent most of his adult life carefully managing his public identity. He was the food writer, the charming, well-connected son of the Queen consort who had successfully carved out a career that existed just adjacent to the royal world without being consumed by it. He gave interviews about restaurants. He wrote books about British cuisine, including a whole cookbook about royal recipes from Queen Victoria to King Charles III. He was good company at dinner, and everybody seemed to know it. But behind that carefully constructed public persona was a man who understood the aristocratic world he had been born into with considerable clarity. He knew how inheritance worked. He knew how property moved through families like his. He knew what it meant when assets were directed deliberately away from certain people and toward others, and he knew what had just happened. Laura Lopes was quieter about it publicly. She had always been the more private of Camilla's two children, less visible than her brother, more guarded in her public appearances. But people who knew her well described a woman who was deeply aware of the family dynamics at play and deeply unhappy with how they had resolved. The frustration between the two siblings wasn't identical in its expression, but it pointed in the same direction. They had expected more, not in the way that people with no legitimate connection to a situation expect things. Their mother was Queen Consort of the United Kingdom. She had been married to the king for nearly 2 decades. She had rehabilitated her public image through years of patient, disciplined work. She had accepted every protocol, navigated every awkwardness, and delivered on every public duty placed before her without complaint. Surely, her children reasoned, that counted for something. Surely the woman who had stood at the coronation of King Charles III, who had worn a crown in Westminster Abbey, whose mother had dedicated the second half of her life to the service of the crown, had earned a degree of consideration for her family. That was the argument being made in private. Not loudly, not through lawyers, at least not yet, but with the kind of persistent underlying pressure that families in that world know how to apply without ever breaking decorum entirely. The problem was that the argument ran directly into a wall because the Queen's arrangements weren't informal understandings. They weren't the kind of gentlemen's agreements that could be renegotiated over dinner. They were legal. They were documented. They had been constructed with precisely the kind of care that makes challenges extraordinarily difficult and extraordinarily expensive. Whoever had advised the Queen on these arrangements had clearly anticipated that they might not be universally welcomed. That realization was its own kind of message. It told Camilla's family something that perhaps they hadn't fully absorbed before. The Queen had not simply decided to leave the estate to William. She had decided to make that choice as difficult as possible to contest. She had, in effect, locked the door and thrown away the key in the same quiet, precise motion. Now, here's what made the whole situation even more combustible. Camilla herself was caught directly in the middle. Her position was almost impossibly delicate. On one side, her children, people she loved, people who were angry in a way that was entirely understandable from a family perspective and entirely impossible to resolve from a royal one. On the other side, the institution she had spent years earning her place within, the institution whose rules and hierarchies she had accepted as the price of admission. She couldn't publicly support her children's grievances without undermining the monarchy her husband led. She couldn't publicly dismiss those grievances without fracturing something important in her own family. And she couldn't say nothing forever, because silence in that situation was itself a choice that everyone around her was interpreting in real time. Sources close to the situation described the atmosphere in private royal circles during this period as genuinely tense. Not the performative tension of families who argue loudly and reconcile quickly, the deeper, colder tension of people who have discovered that they fundamentally disagree about something important and are not sure the disagreement can ever be fully resolved. William's name came up constantly in those conversations. Not always directly, but he was the fixed point around which everything else orbited. He was the one who had received what others felt they deserved consideration for. He was the one whose inheritance had triggered this entire chain of events, and he was the one who had responded to all of it by doing absolutely nothing visibly provocative, which, depending on your perspective, was either admirable restraint or a very sophisticated form of aggression. Because doing nothing when you hold all the cards is itself a power move. William held the estate, he held the legal documentation, he held the weight of the Queen's deliberate, clearly expressed intention behind him. He didn't need to argue, he didn't need to negotiate, he simply needed to wait. And waiting, for a man who had spent his entire life being trained for a throne, was something he knew how to do extremely well. Meanwhile, Camilla's family was learning a lesson that the British aristocracy has been teaching newcomers for centuries. Proximity to power is not the same as power. You can stand next to the fire for years. You can warm yourself by it. You can come to rely on its heat so completely that you forget you don't actually control it. But the moment someone else decides where the fire goes, you feel the cold very quickly. There's a particular kind of power that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't hold press conferences. It doesn't release carefully worded statements through communications teams. It doesn't engage with the noise swirling around it or dignify speculation with a response. It simply exists, solid, immovable, utterly certain of itself. That was the power William chose to exercise in the weeks and months that followed the inheritance becoming known, and it was more devastating than anything he could have said out loud. The palace's official position was predictably one of complete silence, no confirmation of the specific details of the Queen's private estate arrangements, no comment on reports of tension within the extended royal family, no acknowledgement that anything unusual had occurred at all. Just the steady, practiced blankness that royal communications teams deploy whenever a situation is too sensitive to touch and too significant to accidentally inflame with a careless word. To outsiders, that silence looked like discretion. To the people inside the situation, it looked like something else entirely, because palace silence is never neutral. It's always a choice. And the choice to say nothing about a specific set of circumstances always communicates something about who the institution is protecting and who it's prepared to leave exposed. In this case, the silence protected William completely. It didn't address the grievances of Camilla's family. It didn't offer any public softening of the blow. It didn't extend even the smallest diplomatic gesture toward the Parker Bowles side of the equation. It simply closed ranks around the heir to the throne and waited for the storm to pass. That told you everything you needed to know about where the institution stood. But William wasn't relying solely on institutional protection. He was doing something considerably more sophisticated than simply hiding behind palace walls and waiting for things to calm down. He was moving, not dramatically, not in ways that would generate headlines or give his critics something concrete to point at, but in the quiet, methodical way that people who understand long-term strategy move when they know they have the upper hand and want to consolidate it without triggering a direct confrontation. The estate itself became part of that process. Decisions began to be made about the property, administrative decisions, management decisions, the kind of decisions that owners make when they're establishing their relationship with an asset and signaling to anyone paying close attention that they intend to take that relationship seriously. These weren't dramatic gestures. They weren't designed to provoke, but they were visible to the people who needed to see them, and the people who needed to see them were watching very carefully. Within the broader royal household, the reaction to William's handling of the situation was, by most accounts, one of quiet approval. The king's senior advisors, whatever their private feelings about the complexity of the family dynamics involved, understood the importance of the inheritance being managed with stability and seriousness. William was delivering that. He wasn't grandstanding. He wasn't gloating. He was simply doing what inheritors of significant assets were supposed to do. He was taking care of it. That competence, understated as it was, sent its own message to the institution. It reinforced the narrative that the Queen had known exactly what she was doing when she made her choice. It suggested that the inheritance had landed in the right hands. And it made the question of revisiting or challenging those arrangements feel increasingly abstract and increasingly futile. Now here's the detail that sharpened everything considerably. Charles knew, not in a peripheral, vaguely aware way. The king had been fully briefed on the specifics of his mother's arrangements long before they became a source of tension within his family. He had known what the Queen intended, he had known who was going to receive what, and he had chosen, in the years before Elizabeth's death and in the period that followed it, to say nothing that would disturb the arrangements she had made. That placed him in an extraordinarily difficult position, because Camilla was his wife, her children were people he had watched grow up, people he had, by most accounts, genuine warmth toward. Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopez weren't strangers to him. They were family in the complicated, modern, blended sense of that word, and the knowledge that his mother's decisions had caused them real pain wasn't something he could simply set aside because it was institutionally inconvenient. But he also couldn't override a dead queen's carefully constructed legal arrangements without sending a signal that would reverberate far beyond this particular dispute. The monarchy's legitimacy rests in part on the sanctity of its own rules and traditions. A king who unpicks his mother's estate arrangements to smooth over a family disagreement is a king who has demonstrated that the institution bends to personal pressure. That was a precedent Charles was not willing to set. And so he did what the institution had trained him to do. He held the line. He maintained the silence. He continued to appear publicly with both his wife and his son, projecting the image of a family that was, whatever its private tensions, fundamentally unified around the business of the crown. But projecting unity and achieving it are two very different things. Behind the polished public appearances, the conversations were not easy. People with knowledge of the family dynamics during this period have described the household navigating multiple layers of unspoken tension simultaneously. Charles trying to be fair to everyone and succeeding fully with no one. Camilla managing her own complicated feelings while trying to maintain the public composure her role demanded. William present at the necessary occasions, warm enough on the surface, but carrying the weight of a position that everyone in the room understood and nobody could openly discuss. It was, in other words, a masterclass in the peculiarly royal art of dysfunction with good manners. And underneath all of it, the fundamental reality remained unchanged. William had the estate, the legal arrangements were solid, the palace was not going to intervene, and the king, whatever his private sympathies, was not in a position to rewrite history on anyone's behalf. Camilla's family had run into something harder than they expected. They had run into the architecture of monarchy itself, the cold structural logic of an institution that has survived for centuries precisely because it knows how to separate personal feeling from institutional necessity when the moment demands it. The Queen had understood that logic better than anyone, and in the end, her final act with this estate was not just a gift to William, it was a lesson about where real power sits inside the Windsor world, about who the institution chooses to protect when the pressure comes, about the difference between being close to the throne and actually being trusted by it. William had been trusted, everyone else had been reminded of their place. Some moments in royal history look small when they happen. They arrive quietly, without fanfare, without the kind of public drama that fills newspaper front pages and dominates news cycles for weeks. They look from the outside like administrative matters, property arrangements, legal formalities, the kind of thing that gets handled by solicitors in oak-paneled offices and never troubles the general public at all. And then years later, historians look back and realize that those quiet moments were the ones that actually changed everything. This inheritance has the shape of one of those moments, not because of the estate itself, significant as it is, not because of the legal arrangements or the financial value or the particular history of the property involved, but because of what the entire episode has revealed about the internal architecture of the modern monarchy and the fault lines now running through its foundations. Those fault lines were always there. They were built into the structure the moment Charles married Camilla, not because that marriage was wrong, not because Camilla herself was unworthy of the position she now holds, but because blended families are complicated, and blended royal families operating under the weight of centuries of tradition and the constant scrutiny of a global audience are complicated in ways that have no easy resolution. The Queen understood this from the beginning. She accepted Camilla, she gave her public blessing to the marriage, she attended the reception at Windsor Castle after the civil ceremony in April of 2005. She did everything the situation required of her as a monarch and as a mother. But accepting a situation publicly and trusting it privately are two entirely different things. And the estate arrangements suggest that the Queen's private trust had a very specific architecture. One that extended warmly and completely to her bloodline, to the direct continuation of the Windsor dynasty through Charles and then through William, and one that stopped clearly and deliberately at the boundary where the Parker Bowles family began. That boundary is now visible to everyone, and its visibility is changing things in ways that go far beyond the single inheritance dispute. Within the broader royal family, the episode has accelerated a process of realignment that had been developing quietly for some time. The question of where genuine power sits in the post-Elizabeth monarchy is one that every senior royal and every senior royal advisor has been working through since September of 2022. The Queen's death didn't just create a vacancy at the top of the institution. It removed the single figure who had, for 7 decades, served as the ultimate point of reference for every significant decision the family made. Without her, the institution is navigating by different stars, and what the inheritance has shown is that the star William represents is burning considerably brighter than anyone in Camilla's orbit had fully accounted for. This matters for reasons that extend well beyond property. William is not just the Prince of Wales, he is the future of the monarchy in the most literal sense. Every decision the institution makes today is, in some important way, a decision about what kind of monarchy he will eventually lead. Every asset that flows toward him strengthens the foundation he will build from. Every signal the institution sends about where it places its trust is a signal about the reign that is coming. The Queen's inheritance was all of those things simultaneously. It was a transfer of property, it was a declaration of trust, it was a statement about the future, and it was a very deliberate message to everyone watching about which relationships the monarchy considers structural and which ones it considers peripheral. Camilla's family learned they were peripheral. That's a brutal thing to discover, particularly after years of proximity, particularly after watching their mother give so much of herself to an institution that has now in one quiet legal arrangement, made clear exactly how it categorizes her children. But here's the dimension of this story that most people haven't fully considered. The inheritance hasn't just affected Camilla's family, it's affected Camilla herself in ways that may prove more consequential in the long run. Camilla is queen consort. She sits beside the king at state occasions. She carries out royal duties. She has, by any measure, achieved a position of extraordinary influence and visibility. But influence and visibility are not the same as security. And the one thing that every person who has ever operated near the center of power understands is that security, in the end, comes from the institution choosing you rather than from the position you currently occupy. The Queen's arrangements have introduced the question that nobody in the royal household wants to articulate directly. How deep does the institution's acceptance of Camilla actually go? Not the public acceptance, not the carefully managed narrative of rehabilitation and redemption that the palace communications team has spent 20 years constructing. The real acceptance, the private structural acceptance that shows up not in press releases, but in decisions about property and legacy, and the long-term architecture of royal inheritance. The estate suggests the answer to that question is more complicated than the official version admits. And Camilla, whatever her public composure, is intelligent enough to understand that she has spent her entire adult life reading rooms, reading situations, understanding what is really being communicated beneath the surface of polite conversation and official statements. She didn't survive everything. She survived and arrived where she arrived without developing a very finely calibrated sense for what people actually mean as opposed to what they say. She knows what this inheritance means. William, meanwhile, continues to move forward. He carries the inheritance. He carries the Queen's explicit trust. He carries the institutional momentum of an establishment that has aligned itself behind him with a clarity that grows more visible with every passing month. He's not complacent about any of it. People who know him well describe a man who is acutely aware of what has been given to him and acutely aware of the responsibility that comes with it. He understands that the Queen didn't hand him these things as gestures of sentiment. She handed them to him as instruments of continuity, tools for the long work of keeping an ancient institution functional in a world that grows less patient with it by the year. Every asset she directed toward him was another brick in the foundation of a reign she believed needed to be built carefully, deliberately, and with the full weight of institutional backing behind it. That's the real story underneath the inheritance dispute. Not the fury of one family, not the silence of one palace, not the legal arrangements of one estate. The real story is about a woman who spent 70 years holding something together and used her final acts to make sure it stayed that way. She looked at everything around her. She looked at the marriages and the complications and the blended families and the competing expectations. She looked at the institution she had given her life to, and she made her choices clean, deliberate, irreversible. The crown had its future, and she had made certain of it. Queen Elizabeth never did anything by accident. This inheritance was her final word on what the monarchy's future looks like, and the message was unmistakable. William is the future she chose. Everyone else is simply expected to accept it.